My name is Caleb Hayes. Sounds pretty ordinary, right? Like I could be your next door neighbor, the guy who mows his lawn every Saturday morning and waves politely when you drive by. Except I'm not. I'm different. And that difference has everything to do with where I come from. I wasn't born in a neat little suburb with manicured lawns and HOA meetings. I was born in the heart of Appalachia, deep in the hollers where the sun barely touches the ground, in a place where the whispers started before I could even talk. Not whispers you'd hear on the wind, mind you. These were the whispers of stories, of legends of things that crawled in the dark and things that watched from the tree line. The kind of stories that made other kids shiver around campfires, but for me they were just Tuesday. They were as real as the calloused hands of my grandfather and the ever-present smell of wood smoke that clung to everything we owned. My family has lived in these mountains for generations. We're as much a part of this land as the ancient oaks and the winding creeks. We know the secrets the mountains hold, the ones they don't whisper to outsiders. We've seen things, heard things, lived things that would make your blood run cold. And the thing is the stories you've heard. The ones about inbred families, about strange rituals in the dead of night, about things that aren't quite human lurking in the shadows. They're true. Most of them, anyway. And some are even worse than you can imagine. I grew up in a small, dilapidated cabin, nestled so deep in a valley that it felt like the rest of the world didn't exist. Our nearest neighbor was a good 5 miles away, a grizzled old woman named Martha who claimed to be a granny witch, and honestly, I wouldn't have doubted her. We had no electricity, no running water, and no phone service. We lived off the land hunting, trapping, and growing what we could in the small patch of sunlight that managed to break through the dense canopy. My grandfather, Silas, was the patriarch of the family. He was a hard man, weathered and worn like an old leather boot. He had eyes that seemed to see right through you, eyes that held the weight of generations of mountain secrets. He taught me everything I know about survival, about the woods, about the other things. He was also the one who first told me the stories. He'd sit by the fire at night, the flames casting dancing shadows on his face, and his voice would drop to a low rumble as he spoke of the haints and the boogers, of the creatures that roamed the mountains after dark. He'd tell me about the little people, not the cute, whimsical kind you read about in fairy tales, but small, twisted beings with malevolent intent. He'd tell me about the shadow men, tall, gaunt figures that would stand at the edge of the woods and watch, their eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. My grandmother, Elora, was a quieter presence. She was a small, wiry woman with hands that were surprisingly strong. She was the healer of the family, knowing the uses of every herb and root that grew in the mountains. She also knew the ways of warding off evil, of protecting our home from the things that lurked outside. She'd hang bundles of dried herbs above the doorways and windows, and she'd whisper strange incantations under her breath, words that I didn't understand but felt in my bones. Growing up, I thought all of this was normal. I thought everyone lived this way, surrounded by the whispers of the old ways and the constant presence of the unseen. It wasn't until I was about 10 years old that I started to realize just how different my life was. My first real encounter with the outside world came when a group of hikers stumbled upon our cabin. They were lost, their fancy GPS devices useless in the dense woods. They looked at us like we were museum exhibits, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. They spoke in clipped, unfamiliar accents, and their clothes were bright and clean, unlike our own faded and patched garments. They stayed the night, huddled together by the fire, their nervous whispers a stark contrast to the low hum of my grandfather's stories. I watched them, fascinated by their strangeness, by the way they flinched at every creak of the cabin and every rustle in the leaves outside. The next morning, my grandfather led them back to the main trail. They thanked us profusely, their relief palpable. As they walked away, I saw one of them turn back and look at me, a strange expression on his face. It wasn't pity, exactly, but it was close. It was a look that said, "You poor, backward child." That look stayed with me. It was the first crack in the wall of my isolated world, the first hint that there was something wrong with the way we lived. But the real turning point came a few years later, when I was 13. It was a night I'll never forget, a night that solidified everything my grandfather had ever told me, a night that proved the stories weren't just stories. It started like any other night. We had finished our meagre supper of squirrel stew and cornbread, and my grandfather had settled into his usual spot by the fire. He was about to begin one of his stories, but then we heard it. A scream. It wasn't a human scream. It was something else. Something high, pitched and unearthly, a sound that ripped through the silence of the night like a jagged knife. It echoed through the valley, bouncing off the mountain sides, sending chills down my spine. My grandfather's eyes narrowed. He stood up, his hand reaching for the old rifle that always hung above the fireplace. "Stay here," he said, his voice grim. "And don't open the door for anyone, not even me." He slipped out into the darkness, the rifle held at the ready. I watched him go, my heart pounding in my chest. My grandmother grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were wide with fear. We waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the frantic beating of my own heart. Then we heard another scream, closer this time, and then silence. A silence so profound, so absolute, that it was more terrifying than the screams. My grandmother started to pray, her voice a low, desperate murmur. I huddled beside her, my eyes fixed on the door, every muscle in my body tense. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew it was bad. I knew it was something that even my grandfather, with all his knowledge of the mountains and their secrets, might not be able to handle. The wait seemed to last forever. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door creaked open. My grandfather stood there, silhouetted against the darkness. He was breathing heavily, his clothes torn and covered in mud. He didn't say anything, just stepped inside and closed the door behind him, locking it with a heavy wooden bar. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. What was it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He shook his head. "Don't speak of it," he said, his voice hoarse. "Some things are best left unsaid. Some things are best forgotten." But I couldn't forget. I wouldn't forget. That night changed everything. It was the night I realized that the stories weren't just stories. They were warning, and I was living in the heart of them. The whispers had become a roar, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that my life would never be the same. My normal, my safe, my reality was a horror story to the outside. And this was only the beginning. The real horrors still lurked, hidden in the shadows, waiting for their turn to make themselves known. And I, Caleb Hayes, was right in their path. The silence that followed that night was a heavy, suffocating thing. It pressed down on us, filling the cabin with a tension that was almost palpable. My grandfather wouldn't speak of what he'd seen, and my grandmother seemed to retreat further into herself, her prayers becoming more fervent, her eyes constantly darting towards the windows and doors. I, on the other hand, was consumed by a burning curiosity. I had to know what had been out there, what had caused that unearthly scream. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a desperate need to understand. I started to pay closer attention to everything around me. I listened to the whispers of the wind in the trees, the rustling of leaves, the calls of the night birds. I studied the tracks in the mud, trying to decipher their secrets. I spent hours in the woods, exploring the hidden corners of the valley, searching for any sign of the creature that had haunted our night. My grandfather, seeing my obsession, finally relented in his own way. He didn't tell me what he'd seen, but he started to teach me more. He taught me the ancient lore of the mountains, the stories that had been passed down through generations of our family. He taught me the signs to look for, the warnings to heed, the ways to protect myself from the things that lurked in the darkness. He showed me how to identify the tracks of the little people, small, almost childlike footprints that often led to dead ends or disappeared altogether. He taught me the difference between the calls of ordinary animals and the chilling, unnatural cries of the things that weren't quite animal. He showed me the places to avoid, the dark hollows and ancient burial grounds where the veil between worlds was thin. One of the most important lessons he taught me was about the woodshed. It wasn't just a place to store firewood. It was a boundary, a place where things were kept, things that shouldn't be disturbed. The woodshed was a small, ramshackle structure built against the back of the cabin. It was made of rough, hewn logs, its roof patched with scraps of tin and tar. It always smelled of damp earth and decaying wood, a smell that made my skin crawl. My grandfather had always been strict about the woodshed. We were only allowed to go there to retrieve firewood, and we were never, ever to go inside after dark. He never explained why, just repeated the same warning, his voice low and serious. Don't go near the woodshed after dark, nothing good ever comes from it. Of course, that only made me more curious. One night, a few weeks after the incident with the screams, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was in the woodshed. My grandfather and grandmother were asleep, the only sound in the cabin the gentle snoring of my grandfather and the crackling of the dying embers in the fireplace. I slipped out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the valley. The air was cold and still, the silence broken only by the distant hooting of an owl. I crept outside, my bare feet making almost no sound on the damp earth. The woodshed loomed in the darkness, a black shape against the slightly lighter black of the trees. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickle, a primal instinct warning me to turn back. But I couldn't. I reached the woodshed and slowly, carefully opened the door. The hinges groaned, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. The smell of damp earth and decay washed over me, stronger than ever. I stepped inside, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. The moonlight filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting faint streaks of light across the piles of firewood. I could see the rough, hewn logs, the dirt floor, the cobwebs hanging thick in the corners. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rags. It was in the far corner of the woodshed, huddled against the wall. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't rags. It was something else. It was small, no bigger than a child. It was hunched over, its back to me. It was covered in what looked like matted fur, dark and greasy. I could hear a faint sound coming from it, a low, guttural growl. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I knew instinctively that this was something I shouldn't be seeing. This was one of the things my grandfather had warned me about. Slowly, very slowly, the creature began to turn. Its head swiveled around, revealing a face that was both horrifying and strangely familiar. It had large, black eyes that seemed to absorb the light, eyes that held a terrifying emptiness. Its mouth was wide and filled with rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, giving it a skeletal appearance. But the most disturbing thing about its face was that it looked almost human. It had the features of a child, distorted and twisted, but still recognizable. It was as if a human child had been corrupted somehow. The creature stared at me, its black eyes burning into mine. It let out another growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. It started to crawl towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped, caught in the gaze of this thing. Just when I thought it was going to reach me, I heard a voice. "Caleb!" It was my grandfather. He was standing at the door of the woodshed, his rifle in his hands. He looked angry, but also relieved. The creature hissed, its eyes flicking towards my grandfather. It hesitated for a moment, then turned and scrambled back into the corner, disappearing into the shadows. My grandfather grabbed my arm and pulled me out of the woodshed. He slammed the door shut and locked it with a heavy padlock. "I told you never to go in there after dark," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "What were you thinking?" I couldn't answer. I was still shaking, my mind reeling from what I had seen. My grandfather led me back to the cabin, his hand gripping my shoulder tightly. He didn't say anything else, just sat me down by the fire and gave me a cup of strong, bitter tea. I didn't sleep that night. I kept seeing the creature's face, its black eyes, its needle, like teeth. I kept hearing its growl, feeling its presence in the darkness. The next morning, my grandfather took me aside. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness I had never seen before. "That thing in the woodshed," he said, his voice low and grave. "It's a part of our family. A curse passed down through generations." He explained that the creature was the result of a dark pact made by one of our ancestors, a pact with something ancient and evil that dwelled in the mountains. The pact had brought our family power and prosperity, but it had also come with a terrible price. The price was the creature. It was a manifestation of the darkness that had been unleashed, a constant reminder of the debt that had to be paid. It was kept in the woodshed, contained, but never truly gone. "We feed it," my grandfather said, his voice barely a whisper. "Scraps of meat, bones, sometimes other things." He looked away, his face etched with shame. I understood then. The screams I had heard that night, they weren't just the screams of an animal. They were the screams of something that had been sacrificed. My grandfather's silence, his refusal to speak of what he had seen, it wasn't just about protecting me. It was about protecting the secret, the dark, shameful secret that lay at the heart of our family. I was horrified, disgusted, but also strangely understanding. I was a part of this too. The curse, the darkness, the creature, it was all a part of me, a part of my heritage. I looked back at the shed. The sun couldn't quite touch it even in daylight. The darkness of it was palpable. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the thing in the woodshed would always be there, waiting in the shadows, a constant reminder of the price of our existence. And I knew, with equal certainty, that I could never truly escape it. The mountains held us, and all their secrets, tight. The revelation about the creature in the woodshed cast a long, dark shadow over my life. It changed the way I saw everything, my family, my home, myself. The whispers of the mountains seemed louder now, more menacing. The woods themselves felt different, darker, filled with unseen eyes watching my every move. My grandfather, sensing my growing unease, tried to reassure me. He told me that the creature was contained, that it couldn't harm us as long as we followed the rules, as long as we kept the pact. But his words offered little comfort. The knowledge of what lurked in the woodshed, of what my family had done, was a burden I couldn't shake. One of the ways my grandfather tried to distract me, to ground me, was by teaching me about the old coal mine. It was another part of our family's history, a part that was less shrouded in darkness, but no less significant. The mine was located about a mile from our cabin, deeper in the valley. It had been abandoned for decades, long before I was born. My great-grandfather, and his father before him, had worked in the mine, extracting coal from the heart of the mountain. It was a dangerous job, a life of hard labor and constant risk. Many men had died in the mine, victims of cave-ins, explosions, and the dreaded black lung. My grandfather had worked in the mine for a short time as a young man before it finally closed down. He had vivid memories of the darkness, the dampness, the constant fear that hung in the air. He told me stories of the miners, their camaraderie, their superstitions, their encounters with the other things that dwelled in the depths of the earth. He warned me never to go near the mine entrance. "It's a dangerous place, Caleb," he said. "Not just because of the cave, inns and the bad air. There are things down there, things that don't belong in the light of day." Of course, his warning only fueled my curiosity. I had to see the mine. I had to understand this other part of my family's history, this other source of darkness that seemed to permeate our lives. One afternoon, while my grandfather was out hunting, I decided to go. I told my grandmother I was going for a walk, and she didn't object. She seemed lost in her own world these days, her mind consumed by her prayers and her rituals. I followed the old, overgrown path that led to the mine. The woods were thick and silent, the air heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The further I went, the darker it became, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the dense canopy. I finally reached the mine entrance. It was a gaping hole in the side of the mountain, framed by rotting timbers. A rusted metal sign hung crookedly above the entrance, its letters barely legible, "Black Hollow Mine." A cold draft emanated from the mine, carrying with it the smell of coal dust and something else, something ancient and unsettling. I hesitated, my grandfather's warning echoing in my mind, but the pull of the unknown was too strong. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The darkness was immediate and absolute. I had brought a small oil lantern with me, but its light barely penetrated the gloom. I could feel the cold, damp air on my skin, the silence pressing down on me. I moved slowly, my hand trailing along the rough, damp wall. The air was thick with coal dust, making it difficult to breathe. I could hear the drip, drip, drip of water, the sound echoing eerily in the vast emptiness. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. I felt a sense of unease, a feeling of being watched. I could hear faint whispers, sounds that seemed to come from the very walls of the mine. I pressed on, driven by a mixture of fear and fascination. I passed by abandoned tools, rusted machinery, and piles of rubble. I saw the remnants of old support beams, many of them collapsed or rotting. Then I heard it. A distinct sound, different from the dripping water and the whispering walls. It was a scratching sound like claws on rock. It was coming from deeper in the mine. My heart started to pound. I stopped, holding my breath, listening intently. The scratching sound continued, growing louder, closer. I raised my lantern, trying to see what was making the sound. The light flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And then I saw it. It was a figure, huddled in the darkness. It was small, like the creature in the woodshed, but different. This one was thinner, almost skeletal. Its skin was pale and translucent, like parchment. It had long, spindly fingers with sharp claws, which it was using to scratch at the wall. Its eyes were large and black, reflecting the light of my lantern. They were filled with a hunger, a desperation that made my blood run cold. The creature turned its head and looked at me. It let out a low, guttural hiss, a sound that seemed to echo through the entire mine. It started to crawl towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I knew, instinctively, that this was one of the things my grandfather had warned me about. One of the things that dwelled in the depths of the earth, things that had never seen the light of day. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, my lantern swinging wildly, casting flickering shadows that danced around me like mocking spirits. I could hear the creature behind me, its claws scraping on the rock, its hiss echoing in my ears. I stumbled, falling to my knees, scraping my hands on the rough floor. I scrambled back to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest, my lungs burning. I finally reached the mine entrance, bursting out into the sunlight, gasping for breath. I didn't stop running until I was back at the cabin, my body shaking, my mind reeling. I didn't tell my grandfather what I had seen. I knew he would be angry, and I knew he would worry, but I couldn't keep it entirely to myself. I told my grandmother. She listened patiently, her eyes fixed on mine. When I was finished, She nodded slowly. "The mine," she said, her voice a low murmur. "It's a place of darkness. It's a place where the veil is thin. The miners, they disturb things down there, things that should have been left alone." She told me stories of the knockers, small, mischievous creatures that were said to inhabit the mines. They were said to be the spirits of dead miners, or sometimes something older, something more sinister. She told me that the knockers could be helpful, warning miners of impending danger, but they could also be malicious, causing accidents and leading men astray. "They feed on fear," she said. "They feed on darkness. They feed on life." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I realized that the creature I had seen in the mine wasn't just a monster. It was a part of the mine's history, a part of the darkness that had been unleashed by the greed and ambition of men. The whispers in the mine were the voices of the dead, the voices of the trapped, the voices of the things that had been awakened. And I, by entering the mine, had stirred them up again. I'd invited them. I knew I could never go back to the mine, but I also knew that the mine, like the woodshed, would always be a part of me. The darkness of Appalachia, the secrets of my family, the whispers of the old ways, they were all intertwined, bound together, a web that I could never escape. And now, I had added another thread to that web, another layer of darkness to my own soul. The mountains were closing in, their secrets a suffocating weight, and I was beginning to feel like I was drowning in them. The whispers were everywhere now, inside and out, and I couldn't tell if they were warnings or invitations. Part 4, the gathering, the encounter in the mine left me deeply shaken. I avoided the woods, avoided even looking in the direction of the mine entrance. The whispers seemed to follow me everywhere, even into the cabin, even into my dreams. I felt like I was being watched constantly, judged by unseen eyes. My grandfather noticed my withdrawn state. He tried to talk to me, to draw me out, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. The shame of my disobedience, the horror of what I had seen, was too much to bear. My grandmother, however, seemed to understand. She didn't press me for details, but she offered me small comforts, a warm hand on my shoulder, a cup of her special herbal tea, a quiet presence that soothed my frayed nerves. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the valley, my grandfather came to me. He had a strange look on his face, a mixture of solemnity and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "Caleb," he said, his voice low and serious, "tonight is a special night, a night of gathering." I looked at him, confused. "Gathering? What do you mean?" He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "It's a tradition, something our family has done for generations. A way of honoring the old ways, of keeping the balance." He explained that tonight was the night of the autumnal equinox, a time when the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. It was a night when the spirits of the mountains were at their most active, a night when the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred. And it was a night when our family, along with a few other select families from the surrounding hollers, gathered to perform a ritual to appease the spirits, to ensure the continued protection of the land, to maintain the pact. My blood ran cold. The pact, the creature in the woodshed, the sacrifices, it all came flooding back, the horror, the shame, the fear. I don't want to go," I stammered. My grandfather's eyes hardened. "You have no choice, Caleb. This is our way. It's in your blood. You are a part of this, whether you like it or not." His words were like a sentence. I knew I couldn't refuse. I was trapped, bound by the chains of my family's history, by the darkness that flowed through my veins. As darkness fell, we set out from the cabin. My grandmother walked beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. She didn't say anything, but her presence was a small comfort in the growing dread. We followed a narrow, winding path that led us deeper into the woods, to a place I had never been before. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the silence was broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional hooting of an owl. As we walked, I could hear the faint sound of chanting, growing louder with each step. The chanting was low and guttural, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very ground beneath our feet. We finally reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing, a large bonfire had been built, its flames leaping high into the night sky, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. Around the bonfire, a group of people were gathered. They were all dressed in dark, hooded robes, their faces hidden in shadow. I recognized some of them: Martha, the granny witch. From down the valley, Old Man Hemlock, a recluse who lived in a shack on the other side of the mountain, and a few other faces I had seen from time to time in the woods. They were chanting, their voices rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence. The words were in a language I didn't understand, an ancient tongue that seemed to resonate with the power of the mountains. My grandfather led me to the edge of the circle. He handed me a robe, identical to the ones the others were wearing. I put it on, the rough fabric scratching against my skin. As I joined the circle, I felt a strange energy wash over me. It was a feeling of power, of connection, but also of dread. I could feel the eyes of the others on me, assessing, judging. The chanting continued, growing louder, more intense. The flames of the bonfire danced higher, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. Then the chanting stopped. A hush fell over the clearing. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. My grandfather stepped forward. He raised his hands, his voice booming out into the night. "We gather tonight," he said, "to honor the old ways, to appease the spirits of the mountains, to keep the balance." He began to speak in the ancient tongue, the words flowing from his lips like a dark river. He spoke of the pact, of the sacrifices, of the debt that had to be paid. As he spoke, I could feel the presence of something else. Something vast and ancient, something that dwelled in the depths of the earth, something that was listening, watching. Then he turned to me. "Caleb," he said, his eyes locking with mine. "It is time." My heart stopped. I knew what was coming. Two men stepped forward. They grabbed my arms, their grip tight and unyielding. They led me towards the bonfire. I struggled, but it was no use. Their grip was too strong. They brought me to a large, flat stone that stood near the fire. It was stained dark with what looked like blood. I knew then. This was the altar. This was where the sacrifices were made. My grandfather approached me. He held a knife in his hand, its blade glinting in the firelight. "This is for the best, Caleb," he said, his voice filled with a strange mixture of sadness and determination. "This is the only way." I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. I could feel the heat of the fire on my skin, the cold steel of the knife against my throat. But then something happened. A scream. It wasn't my scream. It was a scream from the woods, a scream of pure terror. The men holding me released their grip. Everyone turned towards the sound. And then they came. Out of the woods, they poured. Figures, shapes, creatures that defied description. There were the little people, their faces twisted in grotesque smiles, their eyes burning with malevolent intent. There were the shadow men, tall and gaunt, their forms shifting and flickering like smoke. There was the creature from the woodshed, its fur matted and bloody, its teeth bared in a snarl. And there were others, things I had never seen before, things that seemed to be made of shadow and darkness. They attacked. The gathering erupted into chaos. The robed figures screamed, fighting back with knives and clubs, but it was no use. The creatures were too many, too powerful. I saw Martha, the granny witch, torn apart by the little people. I saw Old Man Hemlock swallowed whole by a shadow man. I saw my grandfather, fighting valiantly, but ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer number of creatures. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, not caring where I was going, just wanting to get away from the carnage, from the screams, from the darkness. I ran until I collapsed, my lungs burning, my body trembling. I hid in a small cave, huddled in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the slaughter echoing through the valley. The creatures, the spirits, the things that had been kept at bay by the rituals, by the sacrifices, had been unleashed. The pack had been broken. The balance had been shattered, and I, Caleb Hayes, the last surviving member of my family, was left alone in the heart of Appalachia, surrounded by the darkness that had always been there, waiting, watching. The whispers had become a roar, a deafening cacophony of ancient rage, and I knew that I would never escape them. The mountains had claimed their due, and I was all that remained. My nightmare wasn't a story anymore. It was my eternal reality. The gathering was over, but the true horror had just begun, and it was mine. Alone,